Well, this week in Unit 7, we are coming to the promise of Isaac with more specificity from, again, Genesis chapter 12. God had promised Abram and Sarai that they would be productive in blessing the nations through their progeny. And years went along. They were in the land, traveling through the land. Again, chapter 15, our second covenant-oriented passage, was the focus upon, again, God's promise of future descendants, promise of the land. It also included, of course, that dark picture of the years that Israel would spend in the land of Egypt. And so we had, again, the additional confirmation of the special covenant relationship there in chapter 15 between God, who unilaterally brings his own character and nature to bear upon this special relationship through this couple. And then in chapter 16, that we skipped over in the process, but it's important to understand how, again, Abraham is going through the typical world's means of procuring an heir to take care of them when they are in their really elderly state. They're already what we would consider today as elderly. In Abram's day, the 75 was not considered elderly. When you got to 100, then you were elderly. But in chapter 16, the procurement of an heir via Hagar, the concubine, who is supplied by Sarah to Abram for the purpose. And of course, Ishmael becomes the son. Chapter 17, the covenant sign or seal via circumcision was outlined, and we looked at that last week. So now, as we move on through, the covenant confirmation becomes more specific. The promise of Isaac. So following this covenant development through the chapters of Genesis, we now arrive at the confirmation of the promised son to be named Isaac. In the backdrop, as we're told later, in the naming of Isaac, when we get to chapter 21, the naming of Isaac in the backdrop of the laughter of Abraham and Sarah. But again, the amazing story of God's ability to bring barrenness, long-term barrenness, to the point of the very elderly state of Abraham and Sarah would be miraculous. And that as they would laugh, again, the idea that a couple of this age would have a child between them was a matter of laughter. You can just imagine Sarah's initial disbelief would come forth, but that disbelief would lead to the naming of Isaac, whose name, of course, means laughter. The covenant themes in this passage, chapter 18, are reiterated. We are brought back to Abraham is to become a great nation, and that would be particularized through Isaac. Ishmael, of course, we learn later on, would also have multiple descendants and nations come forth through here. And again, that's also part of God's call and promise that Abraham would be a father of many nations. Through Ishmael, a variety of other nations would come forth in the Middle East. But the miraculous birth of a son through this barren couple would set a stage for the ultimate miracle of course, in the New Testament, God's son being born to a virgin, Mary of Nazareth. So we have these, what we sometimes refer to as typologies, which are the patterns of God's working through history. God does the miraculous, the amazing, the unfathomable, and we will talk about the amazing thing of this word that's conveyed through the word tele in the Hebrew. But this amazing story is brought forth in the promise of a son, and now we're given his name in advance. Another of the themes of chapters 12 to 36 is that of Abram walking faithfully before God, believing and following God. Again, chapter 15, that Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteous. Then, in chapter 17, he was instructed to walk blamelessly. And now God reminds the reader that God had chosen Abraham to bear the responsibility of instructing his son, to be named Isaac, and the generations which would follow, to walk in his ways of righteousness and justice. God's goal for humanity was justice and righteousness. And these themes are, of course, through the Mosaic law that we'll see later on, through the Pentateuch. The themes of justice and righteousness are very strong. Justice, righteousness, purity, and faithfulness are the major themes of the Old Testament. This instruction then is contrasted immediately. And what we need to do is look at how portions of, again, our English Bible and most modern Bibles have these chapter delineations. But in this particular chapter, we have the inclusion of another aspect of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah are reintroduced. We had Sodom and Gomorrah in the Lot account when Abraham's family group separates from Lot's family group and they migrate down toward the Jordan Valley, down below Jericho into the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, Zoar comes up later in the story as Lot is escaping God's judgment down toward Zoar. But we'll come back to that a little bit later in the narrative. But the contrast between the faithful, just, righteous God, who requires of his faithful followers likewise justice and righteousness, is contrasted by the sinfulness, the great, utter sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that, of course, will be played out in the next portion of the narrative after chapter 18, with a continuation of these divinely ordained messengers that come in this particular chapter. So those cities, which we were introduced to in chapter 13, are cities continuously growing in their sinfulness, and the time for God's judgment to mete it out against them is drawing near in time. So again, the contrast between God's calling a righteous, faithful family in Abraham and Sarah, ultimately Isaac and Jacob and their descendants, is contrast to God's justice has two sides. It is that which is just and right and good, but it also is a message of judgment, that God will not tolerate sin. He is long-suffering, as he was with Israel. But sometimes that means judgment, as when the generation that came out of the land of Egypt, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb and the very, very young people, would not go into the land because of their rejection of God and his provision of land and his faithfulness, and they suffered God's judgment in the wilderness. God is a righteous judge, and that means at times rebellion, sinfulness, again, another major theme ever since Genesis chapter 3, as Adam and Eve rejected God's restriction in the garden against eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in particular evil. They had experienced. They ate of the good, but the tree of the knowledge of good contrasted with evil. They had experienced evil, and evil ultimately means a form of judgment. So those complementary themes, even though I didn't have you translate the latter verses, we are introduced to this aspect of the sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah in verses 20, 21, and then following. So, Unit 7, the promise of Isaac that is about to come to fruition. God's plan was there from the beginning to supply an heir, a son for Abraham and Sarah.